This is the Birth, Baby, and Life podcast with Kristen Burgess, and we're talking about what babies mean for the world in episode number 198. Hey mama, today we are going to talk about pronatalism and what that means for the world, for especially women, and especially for mamas, because you are a mama, you are my audience. And if you don't know me, my name is Kristen. I'm a pregnancy coach. I work with mamas all over the world, helping them to have a healthy, enjoyable pregnancy, to grow a healthy baby, and to have a beautiful birth experience and raise their family in happy homes. So today I want to talk about this topic, which might not be something that you even realize is a thing, because most people are like, what is pronatalism? What does that even mean? Is that like some sort of like weird conspiracy, right? So let's set the record straight and let's talk about this. I have done multiple takes of this podcast episode because this is such a big topic and I want to make sure that I get it right for you. So let's start by talking about what is pronatalism. So natal, that's babies, having a baby. Pronatalism is talking about having babies in a positive light and really and truly encouraging people to consider having babies or to have another baby. But really, as you'll discover listening through this podcast episode, it's talking to people about having babies, period. And being in a state or a place of being positive about babies and families and the human race and all that kind of thing. So with that, let's just jump in. I have a lot of notes, so you're going to see me looking down at my notes because I don't want to miss anything. So the problem is that we don't have enough babies in the world. Now, if you are like me, you probably grew up hearing doom and gloom. The world is overpopulated. There are too many people. Oh my goodness. What are we going to do? Because we have this whole Malthusian thing playing out where there's too many people and there's not going to be enough food and there's not going to be enough resources. And so when I first started hearing about demographic collapse or the birth gap or there just not being enough babies, I was like, what? Really? We have how many? 8 billion people on the planet? How could we have too few humans? But the reality is that the population in almost every developed country, and actually in almost every country in the world, is declining. And there are many ways that you can measure population growth. And what we're going to use the most throughout this podcast episode is total fertility rate. And that one is one that feels right at home with us ladies because it's talking about the number of children that women of childbearing age have. So that's looking at women basically from their late teens up until their late 40s, which is kind of that fertility window for women. Though, as we'll discuss, that ideal fertility window is not quite that broad. But when we're looking at the total fertility rate, we're looking at that group of women and how many children do they have. And the replacement rate that's needed for total fertility rate is 2.1. So that means that to keep your population at the same level that it is right now, you need approximately 2.1 children per woman in that age range. And we know, of course, number one, a woman can't have 2.1 kids. And some women are going to have no kids. Some women are going to have 3 kids. Some women like me are going to have 8 kids. But on average, it's going to balance out. And you want it to be 2.1 to be at replacement rate. If it's below 2.1, you're not at replacement rate. And if it's above 2.1, then you're above replacement rate. Your population is going to grow. So that's what that means. What we have right now is a situation where the world's population is growing and is going to continue to grow until about the mid-2060s, so around 2064 or so. And then what's going to happen is the world population is going to collapse. And the population is not going to grow until 2064 because we're having a lot of babies. The population is going to grow because we have what's called an elder bulge. If you look at population charts and imagine a column, each area on the column is an age. So if you have a youth bulge, it bulges out at the bottom and then goes up because you got a lot of people down here. Well, what we have is a skinny bottom, and then it looks kind of like, an ice cream cone, and you've got a bulge where we have an older population or an aging population. And so what's happening is our population is older, they're living longer, which is a good thing. But there's not actually a lot of babies coming. So it's that elder bulge that's going to cause the population to grow. And then what's going to happen about 2064, as we have some of these older people who are passing away, is we're going to start to see populations across the world collapse. So I like the way that you can listen to some people talking about this. There are people starting to talk about this, and I'll mention some of those resources and also link to them in the show notes below. But a couple that I like, they have some things I really agree on, some things that I think are interesting to think about. We'll come back and touch on those. But is Simone and Malcolm Collins, and what they talk about is population decline is inevitable. It is coming. And what we want to do is talk about it so that we, instead of having a hard landing, we can have a soft landing. So let's talk about what is a hard landing. Why should you care about this? Why does this even matter? Because you're probably thinking, Kristen, why are you even talking about this? So let's talk about why we're talking about this. Why is it important to realize, ladies, that the rug has been pulled out from under us and that there are things that we need to consider that maybe we haven't considered before? I want you to listen to this episode, and then also the next episode is going to be a sister episode for this one, really important to listen to, but also listen to all of the episodes that I'm going to do, have done recently, and then I'm going to do in the coming weeks, because they all connect together and they're really important, but especially this episode and next week's episode, which is its sister episode. So again, we've grown up hearing that we have too many humans on the planet, and then personally, many of us women have grown up hearing that children are a burden, or they'll hold us back, or they restrict women's freedom and that kind of thing. And so the overall message about babies isn't really very positive, even though the feminist movement is supposed to have been a movement of choice. Really, it's more a movement of elevating women to be able to compete in a man's world and letting them know that traditional feminine things like having babies maybe are limiting. And so let's look at that narrative. Let's look at what happens when we stop having babies. And then in the next episode especially, we're going to talk about what does that mean for the individual woman and for your life. So one of the big problems that is going to happen when we're not having as many babies is an economic problem, right? Right now we are functioning, most developed countries are functioning on a debt economy. And what that means is we are racking up debt that we are leaving for our children to pay in future years. And the problem is we're racking up a lot of debt for a lot of people, and there are going to be fewer children in the future to shoulder that debt and to pay that off. So we're leaving a large debt burden. And that's the first and one of the easiest to understand effects of this. And then another thing is when we look at the fact that our population is aging, and so our large population is an older population, and they're going to get older. This includes you and me. We're going to get older, and then there's healthcare costs and all of that sort of thing is associated with this. Very expensive to take care of healthcare for older people, especially if they're not in good health or if they're at the end of their life. So those costs are going to be staggering. And we're looking at those costs, healthcare costs, debt payments, pension costs, or social safety net costs for our elderly who deserve to be taken care of and know that they're taken care of. And right now, you might have, 4 or 2 workers who are working and contributing to the economy and the tax base, and they're funding the pensions for 2 elderly people. In the future, it's going to be multiple elderly people and 1 worker. And so if you think about that and think about the implications of that for our society, for our social programs, for our safety nets, and most especially for the elderly citizens in our countries and municipalities, then how are we going to care for them? This is a big problem that happens when you're below replacement rate, when there are not going to be a lot of children who are growing into workers to help take care of these people. And when we think, and we'll come back to this, but part of this problem is because many of those people are not going to have their own children. So you may think, oh, well, Kristen, you've got 8 kids, and so one of your kids is going to take care of you, but a lot of these people aren't having children. And so who takes care of them when that social safety net breaks down? And that's a primary consideration. Another thing is that our infrastructures need to be maintained. And by infrastructure, I mean things like our power grids and our roads and our buildings and our plumbing. All of that stuff needs to be maintained. And when you don't have people, when you don't have enough humans to maintain that infrastructure, what happens? It crumbles or decays or becomes derelict. So these are all things to think about. And these are not things that are far away. I'll talk about some examples of where we see this happening. For example, we saw with the buildings and urban decay and that sort of thing, we've actually seen that happen in the United States and then other countries as well. Japan is another country that is a good example of it. But in the United States, the city of Detroit at its peak had about 2 million people in it. And then it had a massive loss of population to the point where it's at around 600,000 people today. And we saw all this play out there. Now, Detroit is a comeback city. They're doing a good job talking about it, but the city and working on the problem. But the city was in crisis for a long time. And still, if you drive through, you can see streets of neighborhoods that the city is trying to incentivize people bringing these neighborhoods back. But you've got rows upon rows of just derelict, falling apart houses and big buildings that aren't being used. And in addition, the city was paying pension money out to police officers and firefighters and first responders and teachers and these people who have done good for their community and deserve their pension. But when all of a sudden your tax base is gone, then what do? Who pays for that? And that's one of the reasons why the city went bankrupt. So we've seen this happen, and if you can look at the same in Japan and cities where in the 70s and 80s children played, and then now there's no children there. There's only elderly people sitting alone in apartments in those areas, and shops and storefronts are shuttered, and it's just a dramatic change. And that's what you see as population begins to decline. One of the documentaries that I would encourage you to watch is called Birth Gap, and you can watch the first part of it on YouTube. I'll definitely link it below, and I'll probably also have it on this page if you want to watch it right with the show notes. And one of the things that one of the experts being interviewed in the Birth Gap documentary said was, imagine a worldwide cascade of shrinking economies. And so I want you to think about that, just that phraseology for a minute, a worldwide cascade of shrinking economies. It doesn't bring to mind good things. And when our birth rate falls, when our total fertility rate falls, it seems like we're not going to have the innovation and the humans that we need to create a robust and growing economy. And we'll come back and talk some more about specific points or possible arguments to that in a moment. Another real worry, if you've got a declining population or even people groups that are declining to the point of, fading into existence, they're endangered species, so to speak, they may go extinct, is the possibility of a great homogenization of your culture, because you lose diversity, you lose people groups. The only resistance, so what we see is that the birth rate, the total fertility rate, seems to drop when a country reaches a certain level of prosperity. The women are educated, the families are more prosperous overall, and those are good things. And in this episode and the next, we're going to tackle how do we increase the fertility rate while we also maintain things like women's rights and education and those things that are so important. But we do see a correlation between those things happening and the total fertility rate dropping. The only people groups that seem resistant to that are ones that have strong religious beliefs. For example, Jewish beliefs or conservative Christian beliefs. Their birth rates are either at replacement rate or they're at least higher than the people around them. So it could be that in the future we see that these groups continue to flourish or to be around because they're continuing to have babies while other groups die out. And one of the things that I firmly believe that I talk to my children about is, as a human race, we need diversity of thought. We need diversity of experiences. We need diversity of people, because it's through diverse ideas, it's through varied ideas, it's through deliberation and talk and wrestling with these things and trying things and experimenting and innovating that humanity flourishes and that we find solutions to our problem. And so when you shrink down to one homogeneous group, you lose some of that diversity and innovation, and you may have some people who can think outside the box, but you may lose some of that, at least for a time being. And so that is a real issue. And you may have some groups that are rich, groups that have rich cultural heritages that just die out and go extinct. And we don't have those groups anymore. I used to think that when people warned about intermarriage, not necessarily racially, but especially intermarriage, like, I had an aunt who would say, well, I want they are Jewish, and I want my children to marry good Jewish spouses. And you think about it, it's because they want that cultural heritage. Or if you say, Native American, if we have some families that are made up of Native Americans and emphasize that culture, and then that cultural heritage continues. But if there's only intermarriage or these groups aren't having any babies at all, then we lose that cultural diversity and those rich ethnic heritages, or they become something that's only held in archives rather than having living representatives of that culture, which is, I think that's a net loss for humanity. So that's something to think about. And then when we have people who aren't having babies, when childless adults are the norm, and that is actually what we're trending to, We lose things when everybody is focused on their own individual success and marriages and enduring partnerships aren't happening. Then we lose that. We lose that tradition, and we lose that companionship as a race. We lose extended family groups because there's just no children. What we're going to see, this kind of goes back to my first point with the declining birth rates, is in a generation, for every 100 Americans, there's going to be 3.7 great-grandchildren. 3.7. That's not a lot. So our extended families, we're going to lose extended families. We're going to lose family connections. We're going to lose greater community connections because there's just not going to be people, and there's not going to be that interconnectedness that once pulled us together as families and communities and that sort of thing. And then there's just this lack of support for the family, like I talked about when I talked about the elderly a few minutes ago. Many of those elderly, we see this again in Japan right now. We see many single elderly people who never had children. And so now they're alone. There's nobody to be there for them, to celebrate holidays with them, to celebrate family milestones with them, and there's nobody to take care of them, or even just to give them a level of companionship that as humans we crave. And that's a tragedy. It's a heartbreaking tragedy, even above and beyond the economics. The tragedy of this loss of community, of this loss of cultural heritage, of this loss of our growing old in communities, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and just this big sense of a happy family. And they don't have that. Instead, they're alone and unable to care for themselves. That's a tragedy. And that is something that we are facing. That's a real loss when we lose our fertility rates and when we stop having babies. So right now we're in this paradoxical place of we have a housing crisis in many countries. But what if it goes the other way? What if there are these derelict neighborhoods? Like I talked about, Detroit, Japan have examples of that right now. South Korea is the country that demographically, from what we know, is probably in the worst place right now with a 0.7 fertility rate. Remember I said 2.1 is the replacement rate, and actually each decimal place, each 0.1, represents a dramatic decrease in the number of babies being born. So South Korea has, they're going to die out as a nation, as a civilization. And so that is, again, something to think about when you have all of this. Like right now, we don't have enough houses, but in a generation, there will be more houses than there are people to live in them. And people who are living in them are going to be living alone. And that's something that's really sobering to think about and to stop and to think about. And it's something that's so different from the dominant narrative that you've probably heard that you really have to stop and consider it and to think about it and to go, that this isn't good. This doesn't look good for us, for humanity, for our world. It doesn't look good. And what happens is when people aren't having babies, but they have ideologies that they're trying to pass on. Well, the only way they can pass those ideologies on is by teaching other people's kids. And so sometimes you have like these ideologies where, they're trying to capture your children and get them to think like you. And then what happens is that those kids no longer have kids because they're kind of poaching off the groups that are having babies. They're kind of trying to poach and pull these kids off and like get them to think like them. But then the whole basis of it is don't have babies. And so you just end up with cascading loss of, fertility on a figurative or a literal level, which we'll talk about. So, ultimately when you indoctrinate, absorb, and then sterilize literally or figuratively people, then you end up with far less diversity, and you also end up with just declining humanity. And it's not a good situation for the human race, because when we have had more people, we have had more innovation. So with that, let's talk about why aren't people having babies? We see some of the problems that are coming down the pipe if they're not having babies, but why aren't people having babies? And so one of the things that you might hear as well, isn't the declining birth rate because kids are so expensive, or because we have to work and we can't have work-life balance, we can't be there with our babies and do all of this at the same time. But raising a child isn't proportionally more expensive than it was in the past. A good book to read, which is a book that's exploring why women might choose to have many children. College-educated women might choose to put career on hold and have many children. So that's what this book is exploring. It's called Hannah's Children. And it's a great book. I will link to it in the show notes. And what was discovered in the research for that book is that having a child is not proportionally more expensive today, though some of the expectations are different, like education and that sort of thing. But part of it is, number one, part of it is that there's this lifestyle expectation, like, I'm going to give my kids all of this, or we're going to start off on this standard of living. And I've heard my parents tell stories of when they were starting out, my grandparents when they were starting out, and even thinking about where I started out, as a young woman, and having roommates, or starting out barely out of high school and married, and, you're kind of working your way through college and scrapping your way up until you go up and work your way up and have a higher paying job and can move up into a better neighborhood and that kind of thing. Or move from a place with roommates to your own place, that kind of thing. But today's young people seem to want to they want to leapfrog right into where they don't have to worry about that, or somehow they want to say that there's something wrong societally if they have to start down low. So I think in some ways there may be an expectation, that you're going to be able to give your kids all of this from the get-go, or that children even need all of this, hoopla from the get-go, like preschool and tutoring and all of these advantages. And I can tell you, the research shows that kids who have dinner with their family every night, and who have parents who are involved in their schooling, and who ask questions, and who take them to museums and things which are often free. I mean, I'm not talking about you got to fly to Europe and go to all these museums, but more that you're exposing them to culture, to art, to history, talking about things with them. Like, they hear conversations in the home and are involved in those. And there are family traditions that are important to them. That's what helps kids turn out well. Learning to read and write and do math and understand history and basics of science and be literate in our world's cultural history. That's what gives children success. It's not necessarily expensive ski lessons or vacations or all of that sort of thing. Right. So this idea that children are proportionally more expensive is not true. And the other thing is even in places where some of the things that we typically think are very expensive, for example, in the United States, like a college education for our child or childcare, even in countries where those things are subsidized or outright paid for, the fertility rates are still low. In fact, in the United States, where we have those quote-unquote burdens, our fertility rate is still a little bit higher than many European countries that are directly subsidizing these things. And so that isn't to argue that one policy is better or worse. It's simply to cause you to pause and go, oh, well, is it really actually about the cost of having children? Is that really what this argument is about? That's a convenient Band-Aid. But it may not really be the reason that people aren't having babies. And also, if you think about it, the poorest families in the world tend to be the ones who are having the most babies. The only region of the world that's above replacement rate with total fertility rate is sub-Saharan Africa, and that's one of the poorer regions in the world, and we'll come back and talk about them more. And then we also look at some countries like Asia that have long working hours. Well, they have low total fertility rates. We've mentioned Japan and South Korea already, and they're quite low. But also if you look at countries like the Scandinavian countries that have generous paid parental leave, and European countries that have generous time off and shorter work weeks, again, their total fertility rates are still tanking. So it's not necessarily this work-life balance or financial thing. Even though that seems like it's the most obvious, that isn't necessarily or even really what's going on. So I like Malcolm and Simone Collins, whom I mentioned a few minutes ago. They argue that people are really optimizing for pleasure, and I do think that's a piece. That's a piece, because when you listen to people and listen to interviews of people who have decided not to have children, one of the things that they talk about is they want their freedom, or they want financial freedom. They want to be able to travel. They want to be able to, have the time freedom to do these lessons or write their books or whatever, or apparently go to Costco and buy whatever snack they want. That's a big thing on the DINK videos, which is DINK, dual income, no kids. I don't understand why all of them harp on going to Costco to buy snacks, because I can go to Costco and buy whatever snacks I want. But apparently they think that most parents can't do that. And I will say that for true, there is something to the fact that as a parent, you lose freedom. You lose time freedom. My kids were at summer camp last week, all but Phoenix, so only my little guy was here. And I was able to get a bit more done with having only one kid around the house than when I'm trying to negotiate the situation with, a lot more children at the house. But even having said that, I think that the core and root issue that we're facing here isn't necessarily because people are only focused on themselves and only focused on like a level of hedonic pleasure, even though I do think that plays into things, and that might be the root or a seed for what becomes the real problem with fertility rate, because it's actually, it is childlessness that is driving the fertility rate down. But for the most part, it actually seems to be unplanned childlessness that is driving our total fertility rates down. So that's what we're going to talk about and understand, what is this and why does this really matter? And especially it matters for you to understand so that you can talk to your children about it, because this is the world that they are going to grow up in, and that they need to understand what's coming, and you need to understand what's coming and what this problem is. And it's really important for figuring out how you're going to talk to them about it. Childlessness is the driver, not necessarily smaller families, because we might think, okay, well, people are still having like one kid, right? So it's more one kid families. But if you look at the statistics, and if you watch the Birth Gap documentary, they do a great job illustrating this point in that documentary. But if you look at the statistics, family makeup really has not changed. So Japan is a good example. In the 1970s in Japan, 6% of Japanese mothers had 4 or more kids. Now, 6% of Japanese mothers have 4 or more kids, but there are far fewer Japanese mothers overall. So if you have one child, you're still just as likely to have 2 or 3 or even 4 children as you were in the past. What is going on is that many people are not having children at all. And like I said, it is an unplanned thing. So you've got about 5% of women throughout history who have been childless, either because of infertility or because they really didn't want to have children. And so those women should not be mothers if they really don't want to have children. But 5% is very, very small when we look at the scope of how many women become mothers. That means 95% of women do become mothers. So the real issue is becoming a parent at all, becoming a mother at all. And so childlessness seems to be more of a thing by circumstance, because it's not a planned thing. It's not a desired thing. Most people assume that they want to have children. If you interview most young people, they'll tell you, well, one day I want to be a parent. And most of them will tell you, well, I want to have like 1 kid. And the reality is if they had 1 kid, they'd probably end up having 1 or 2 or 3. But most people will tell you, I have a kid. Or then if you talk to people in their 20s, they'll tell you, well, one day I want to have children. And so that's the thing. It's always a one day. And that's really the shift that we see now, is that it's a one day thing. And childlessness becomes a thing that happens based on circumstance and based on the shifting value system that we live in now. So you're much less likely to have children if you delay childbearing. If you reach age 30 without ever having a child, there's a 50% chance that you as a woman will never have a child. And so this is something, I mean, if you're listening to this podcast, chances are you're pregnant or you already have children. But this is something to listen to if you are listening just because you're interested in having kids one day, or especially as you're thinking about how you talk to your children and how you teach your children. And definitely listen to the next podcast episode, because we're going to talk about some things that are helpful for you and also helpful for you as you talk to your daughters about the choices that they make, because this is really, really important. You're less likely to have a child if you delay childbearing. One of the big problems, and you'll hear people talk about this a lot, is the trouble finding a partner. And the truth is the longer you wait, the less likely you are to find a partner. One of the things is just being in a relationship can be difficult, and it can take time to get to know somebody in a relationship. So if you think about it, if you spend a number of years just kind of doing the hookup culture thing, which is totally toxic to women, and we don't have time to go through it in this episode. But if you hook up for a while and then you have a few longer term relationships of 1 or 2 years each, and it takes you a while to realize, well, this maybe isn't the right person, then all of a sudden you're in your 30s and the clock is against you, and other things are also against you because, first of all, I think men, for better or for worse, are intimidated by a woman who's reached a certain level of career success because, it's a lot harder when you marry in your 20s. Suzanne Venker says this. I'll talk about her a lot more in the next podcast episode, but her resources are really great. If you marry or enter a long-term partnership in your 20s, the two of you can grow and mature together. But oftentimes when you're marrying in your 30s, you are already really developed as a person and your lifestyle is really developed. And so you're trying to find somebody to fit that in rather than kind of building a life together. And that can be a hindrance. And men may want to look for younger women. And so that's another thing to look at. And you may be pickier about the man that you choose because you've reached a certain level of success and you want a man who's at that level or above that level of success. And women often want to look for men who are a few years older. That just tends to be a thing. Women like men who are a couple, 3 years older than them. And so those men may be looking at younger women, especially if they're wanting to start families. They may be looking at a younger woman because they want somebody who's going to be able to still have babies. And there is a big issue there because the biological clock is really and truly a thing. And when you delay childbearing because you've slotted in years of traveling and career and college and all of that thing first, and all of a sudden you're in your 30s, you are really and truly facing lower fertility. Now, at the beginning of the year, I did a natural fertility course, which I'm really proud of and really enjoyed. I'll put a link to it in the show notes, but the truth is, I want every woman who wants to conceive naturally to be able to do it, but fertility does decline with age. And even when we can and should do proactive things like I cover in the course to boost natural fertility, and some doctors really believe that some of these things can boost fertility levels significantly, you are still looking at the fact that it is harder to get pregnant, and you may need to use ART, assisted reproductive technology, IVF, that sort of thing, which I'm not opposed to. I think those things are fine for women who want to grow their families that way. I support moms in basically, any choice that they make as far as growing their family goes, because I work with so many moms in my pregnancy coaching and in my mommy coaching work. But it is harder, even to the point where it doesn't happen for many women. In fact, if you watch the Birth Gap documentary, it can be heartbreaking to watch some of the interviews with women that, it was too late. And so and it's true for men too, because as a man gets older, unless he's amassed significant wealth, it may be much more difficult for him because he's competing with like younger, hunkier guys, right? For women. So the problem becomes that there is this unplanned childlessness, and that is really the driver of our lower total fertility rates today, is this unplanned childlessness. People just not realizing, because nobody's been talking about this, and certainly nobody, except for some people like Suzanne Venker, are talking to young women about the fact that, if you prioritize a long education and then building your career, you may get to a point where marriage and children, they're not interchangeable. See, that's the cool thing about being a woman, is you can have babies and then go on to have an awesome career. Like, don't believe anybody that tells you otherwise, right? But it doesn't work the other way around all the time, because whereas a career, you can go back to school and study for we'll talk about this again in the next episode, sequencing your life, and still find great success and have your children too. You can have your cake and eat it too, just maybe not all at the same time. That's what Suzanne says. But it doesn't work the other way around as well. You can't necessarily build something and then go back and be able to conceive as easily as you could before. So this is not necessarily something to tell women don't get an education, don't have a career. But it's just to tell women to think about the order in which you do things. And it's a valid thing. And I don't want to rabbit trail too much because we'll come back to that in the next episode. So let's talk some more. It's much harder to get pregnant. I thought I had time. is something that you'll hear. So let's talk about some common, some common arguments against pronatalism. So one of them is, doesn't it bring poverty? Like, if we have all these people on the earth, aren't they all poor? And the truth is in most countries in the world, increasing populations have brought increasing prosperity, increasing wealth, increasing opportunity, increasing careers, increasing innovation. That Malthusian hypothesis just did not play out. As the world population increased, so did wealth, so did standard of living. Look, even in most of the poorest countries in the world, every single person today has a cell phone. That's amazing. Every single person has a computer in their hand that is far more powerful than IBM mainframes half a century ago. That's amazing. And it doesn't mean we don't still have work to do. But what it means is we really have made great progress. And the belief is that we could continue to make great progress. And it may be that this is a Goldilocks thing, right? So we don't necessarily want too many people, but we also don't want too few. Maybe we want just right. And so there's a lot of room for deliberation and talk on this. But the reality is that humanity has brought prosperity, right? Another argument that kind of pigtails or piggybacks off that one is, what about pronatalism being anti-environment? Isn't that a thing? And I guess I'm positive, I'm an optimist in this, because I can look and say, yes, many of the things that we have done on the road to human innovation and increasing the human standard of living has harmed our environment. But I also believe that there's a lot that we can do to change that. And one of the best ways we can do to change that is to bring this creative human capital called brain power into the mix. I go to these entrepreneur meetings in my area, and I love sitting around the table, like this big table with 20 or 30 entrepreneurs, and hearing everything that they're working on, housing crisis and climate change and all of these different things, and each one of them is passionate. Now, some of them are doing frivolous things, right? They're going to open a ping pong sauna or something. I don't know. But many of them are really and truly trying to solve the world's problems. And when you hear all of these people who are so passionate, you can't help but feel excited for humanity and for the human race and where we could go. But we need to have humans, we need to have people, and we need to have economies that are robust and allow for innovation and entrepreneurs to be able to try and fail a whole bunch as they're finding the ultimate solutions that will really help. And I believe that if we got this far, and our grandparents and great-grandparents and ancestors left this legacy for us, all of them worked to give us this that we have today. Like the fact that I'm even able to teach you wherever you are in the world, and you can listen to it on your cell phone, is amazing. A beautiful legacy from our forefathers and foremothers. And think about, what could we leave to our children? And all of that brilliance and human ingenuity that came before us. What is going to come after us? So that's how I feel when I think about the climate and environment and that sort of thing, is yes, there's been some problems. There have certainly been some unintended consequences and even some willful blindness. But the way to fix that is to have conversations and to continue to innovate and to ask, how can we have a flourishing humanity and also a flourishing environment? Because I don't believe that those two things need to be mutually exclusive. Then again, global fertility rates, the growing population, I feel like we talked about that quite a bit. Firstly, the population is going to start to decline. And because we're seeing this even in those sub-Saharan African countries, which are still above replacement rate right now, they're estimated to decline by about 1 child per woman for every generation. So they're also on the decline. In fact, the advantage that I think that they have is they may watch developed nations collapse and learn something from that. But if developed nations are collapsing because of population collapse, then those economies are also going to collapse. And so what we want to look at is, for the world, we want robust economies worldwide, especially as these less developed countries are finding their stride and getting to where they want to be. So, the fact that the worldwide population is high is what we see right now in the moment. And one thing with total fertility rate is there's a lag before you see the effects of the fall. And so we're like a generation away, but that generation is your children's generation, and it's your generation of old age. So this is something to think about and consider right now. Another argument is that pronatalism is nationalistic, or somehow like religious fundamentalist or something like that, or even supremacist. And I guess I go back to what I talked about a little bit ago, where I was talking about cultural diversity and heritage. We want people to have babies so that we have this diversity of thought and we maintain these rich heritages that we had. Maybe maybe it's true that there are some groups here and there that are preaching that people need to have babies because they want their particular group to be supreme. But I don't think, even if you listen to the majority of people who are bringing a pronatalist message today, that is not the majority. Most of them are people who are truly worried about our elders, or truly worried about humanity and our future as a race and where we're going. And so I think, even though you might could say there's some extremists out there, they're not really the majority. Though a real concern is if those people truly become the only people having babies, then that kind of backwards extremist ideology might be the ideology of the future, and we don't necessarily want that to happen either. So I think, again, there are always going to be extremists here and there, and some of them may include pronatalism on their agenda, but this is definitely not a nationalistic supremacist agenda at all. This is an agenda that's looking at the world that your children are going to inherit and live in, and what kind of a world do we want for them, and also an agenda that looks at human flourishing and creativity and heritage, and how do we preserve that and perpetuate that. Could pronatalism be eugenic? And that's something that comes up. The couple that I mentioned before, Simone and Malcolm, they're really big proponents of, for example, IVF and whole genome sequencing of embryos so that they can select embryos who have lower chances of cancer and that sort of thing. When I was growing up, like when I was in high school, a movie that I liked was Gattaca, and it deals with some of these issues way back then. It's a great movie, very thought-provoking. And so I think these are discussions that need to be had, because you can make arguments for, doing gene sequencing of embryos because you can reduce the rates of cancer and those sorts of things, but also could you preferentially select for other things? And there are going to be some groups, for example, some of these religious groups who are having more babies, for whom that whole concept is not something that jives with them. So I think that there could be robust discussions about the perspectives of some people in some of these pronatalist circles. But again, I don't really think that this is that's not necessarily an ultimate thing or even a big thing for many of these people. Another thing is, won't AI solve all these problems about us needing to have more babies? And maybe it will solve some of the problems, but, if you build all these robots to take care of society, who maintains the robots? And ultimately, can a robot really replace for a human being, for example, in elder care? Could a robot take over the job of a nurse and do what nurses do? I met a girl who was a dental hygienist, and she would have people come in and pour their heart out while they were feeling nervous before they were waiting for the dentist to come in and work on their teeth. And the reality is could a robot actually fill that place? Could a robot ever replace our therapists? Could a robot replace our teachers? These are questions. I was reading an article in the newspaper about young men who are HVAC technicians in New York City, working in these super complex boilers, and some of the work that they're doing, I'm not sure that a robot could ever do that. So again, who maintains the robots and who maintains this infrastructure? We can't replace it all with AI. We just can't. I had a dishwasher repair that needed to be done, and I called for the repair, and they had a chat bot text with me and diagnosed the problem. Well, when the technician got there, the robot, and I knew this, my son knew this, had been completely wrong, right? AI just isn't ever going to completely replace humanity, and somebody has to maintain it all. So AI is not the solution. And then piggybacking on that, and then another thing to think about with AI is part of the way that our economies work is by being consumers, and robots are not consumers. So, who wants the products that you're going to make? How does that impact our economy if it's all robots and not people? Because what do robots really need except a maintenance man? So, but another thing that comes up is immigration. Aren't pronatalists anti-immigration, or alternately, won't immigration solve all of our problems? But, we're not going to get into a full discussion on immigration or your perspectives on immigration, but we're going to assume that we're talking about immigrants who are legally entering a country and who are wanted there. But immigration isn't going to be able to replace the number of people leaving, because, where are the immigrants going to come from? I believe that was Elon Musk who proposed that in one of his talks about pronatalism. So where are the immigrants going to come from? South America is below replacement rate. India is below replacement rate. China is far below replacement rate. Everywhere in the world, except for sub-Saharan Africa, is currently at plummeting total fertility rates. So where are the people going to come from? They're just not going to be there. So you aren't going to have immigrants coming in because there aren't going to be any immigrants. And another thing, it's okay. I'm not one of these people who is one of those people who thinks that we should be hating on our nations just because some of our national heritage is shameful, because I think that's true of any nation. I think that it's okay to teach children to be proud of their nationality and to be proud of their heritage and to understand the mistakes that their country made in the past. And there is truth that when people come into a country, you want them to be coming in via a legal way and be proud of that heritage that they're stepping into. So that's just a little aside, really. But, immigration is a great thing, but it's also okay to raise children in your country, to be proud of their country, and to be proud citizens of their country. So immigration isn't the answer, nor is pronatalism anti-immigration. The truth is just, you won't be able to replace all the babies who aren't coming by immigration, because there's not babies coming in those countries either. So that's the problem. And then, is pronatalism anti-woman? We are going to devote a whole episode to this on the next episode, so I'm not going to go into it a lot. But we can say that higher birth rates do correlate with lower education, lower employment, fewer women's rights. So how do we protect against those things while still increasing our birth rate? We don't want our birth rate. We don't want cultures that rise up that hold women back in order to have more babies. But we do want to have more babies. So how do we address that? Like I said, we're going to talk about that more fully in the next episode. I like what Malcolm Collins said. We want to change culture to emotionally reward women for having kids and make it a desirable thing to do. Because ultimately we don't want to coerce birth, but we want to understand the realities of demographic decline, and we want to encourage people to consider having families. The big thing seems to be considering having families sooner. And we want society to support those who are having families. And then I think there's a piece of soul searching to all of this, and this is kind of, where I'll start to close it on, is, what is all this for? If we've built the society, if our ancestors worked for this, what is all of it for? Who are we leaving this to? Is it just to tear it all down and to say it was horrible? Or to leave it to nobody? If we've made all these advances and seen all this positive growth and change, why are we so negative about the opportunities that our children have and what they can do, to the point where we aren't even giving birth to them? We're stuck in like this nihilistic trap. And so we need to ask, what is this for? And if we've come to this point, shouldn't we be optimistic that our children can take this baton and run with it even further? Ultimately, I think it's about changing the narrative that humans are bad or that culture is bad, and we certainly need to change the narrative that children and families are limiting to women or limiting even to men. They're limiting to couples, or that marriage is limiting. We need to change these narratives and other things like they're too expensive or this or that. Because really this is about understanding that children, that the elderly, that people, that human beings, they're beautiful and amazing and worth caring for. We're all imperfect. We're all sinners. But we all also have a spark of the divine. We are all also creative, incredible individuals who were made with a purpose and intention, knit together in all of our mother's wombs. And that is beautiful. We are fearfully and wonderfully made. And each of us is worthy. And our children, unborn, children who are not yet here, they're worthy too. And while we may have a whole host of problems, we've solved a lot of problems throughout human history, and I'm at least enthusiastic that we can solve more, including, I hope, this one. So in the next episode, let's talk about the implication for women and having babies, and I look forward to seeing you then.